Thank you, everyone, for coming. Let me get this. And thank you very much, Daryl, for being here. I'm actually really thrilled about this conversation we're going to have. So just a brief intro. We are Commonwealth Canada. We're an organization that advocates for land value tax, sovereign wealth funds to collect the unearned value from nature, to address inequality, to reduce housing prices, to create a better future for everyone. In our report at commonwealth.ca, you can see that land has the largest component of what could be considered the taxable economic rent, unearned wealth in this country. And so we're interested in exploring, like, what are the impacts of this, and can it work, and what are the benefits? Because we are at a time where housing has reached over 40%. Has epic proportions. The housing prices to income ratio has gone completely crazy. People are putting off having children, waiting to buy a house. Like it just, things have gone bananas, and it seems that existing solutions just aren't working. So really excited about this conversation with Daryl, who is chief economist at Redfin. Redfin is like it's like MLS for Canada, but also includes brokerage. It's kind of all things real estate. Very impressive, and I think Daryl, his position is very important for the movement around the world, in fact, to represent land value tax. And she has been interviewed on Bloomberg and CBS and many places, talking about how this can fix the housing market. So that said, we'll get right into it. And I've also been interacting with Daryl on Twitter, so it's really exciting to have a face-to-face conversation. And you also can participate. So we encourage you to ask questions. You can visit slido.com, put in this number to access questions for this particular talk. I'll be monitoring it and maybe asking questions during the Q&A during our fireside chat. And after that, it'll go into a general Q&A with everyone. There are also a lot of experts in the room. Experts, feel free to also post your questions. It'll really help. And also to participate when we go into the general Q&A part. So that said, let's begin. Just gonna unshare the screen. One moment. Okay, Daryl, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So my name is Daryl Fairweather. I'm the chief economist at Redfin. It's a website and an app where you can go and see all the home listings that are available in the US and actually many parts of Canada. We have some Canadian presence too. We also have a brokerage, we have a rental company, and some other real estate related entities underneath our umbrella. My job is to study the housing market and to communicate to our real estate agents, to our customers, what is going on in the housing market and why things are the way they are in the housing market. And in doing that job, I keep returning to land value tax because it is one of the underlying problems with the housing market, at least in many parts of the United States, that the tax structure incentivizes people to stay in their homes for a very long time without really improving the home. And they're able to gain a lot of equity in their homes, and the land values underneath their homes are going up. And this creates distortions in the housing market, and it makes housing more expensive, and it reduces the supply of housing. So it's just something that I have personally taken an interest in because it is something that just keeps coming up over and over again. Anytime there's an issue in the housing market, land value tax seems to be one of the tools that could address that issue. Particularly in California. I don't know how familiar you are with California's property tax structure, but they have this terrible law called Prop 13, where a homeowner is able to fix their property tax essentially in time at the point that they bought it. And because it's fixed, you might have somebody who bought their home in the 1980s paying only, 5% of what the property tax would be if somebody bought that home today. So it creates a lot of distortions and kind of creates a lot of bad problems in the housing market. So that's how I came to it. I also have a PhD in economics. So back when I was getting my PhD at the University of Chicago, I remember learning about tax incidence and learning that a land value tax is the only efficient tax, but it was a very small part of my education, but it was something that I always remembered and came back to when I got into the housing market side of economics. So that's my story with land value tax. And yeah, I try to educate people about it. It is not the most intuitive thing for people to understand. And a lot of my job is just being an economics communicator. So I take it on myself to try to explain it over and over again until people get it. And I know there are a lot of land value tax advocates that do the same. So I appreciate all of your work in that area.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions. So you touched on, and thank you for your personal work for promoting this. It's probably beyond the scope of your role, but it's something that we're all doing and all very passionate about as well. So you touched upon a lot of different impacts that distortions that currently exist. And you know, in your Bloomberg interview, it was framed as the tax that could fix housing. So how would land value tax do that? Like, what are some of the main things it would correct in your views? Main distortions or poor incentives?
So the main distortion that I see is people staying in their homes for too long without really having to feel the pressures that renters feel. There's this imbalance between homeowners and renters, where if your neighborhood improves as a homeowner, you get that wealth. If like, say, a beautiful park is built next door to your house, that improves the value of your land, you get to keep that as the homeowner. But if you are renting that home, your rent would go up because more people would demand to live in that home. So that imbalance, I think, is one thing that could be fixed by a land value tax. Also, land that's not being used to its highest use. There have been a lot of great YIMBY laws passed in recent years, but in California in particular, I am concerned that they aren't going to be as effective as they could be because of the property tax structure. So laws that, for example, allow you to build an ADU in your backyard, people may not choose to do that if they have a low mortgage payment, low property taxes. They don't necessarily want a tenant in their backyard. But if there's a land value tax, that would nudge them to try to put their land to the highest use. And that's really important in some of these densely populated cities, because the alternative is that people go homeless because there aren't enough housing units available. So I think, you know, we all have a responsibility to the land. We all can potentially benefit from the land, and it just doesn't make sense that a homeowner is allowed to, like, you know, have their plot of land that they don't need to, like, feel they don't have any pressure on them to make improvements as the economy changes. They can just, like, kind of put their blinders on and stay in the same place. But everybody else, they have to deal with the reality that, you know, things change and we need to build for the future. So yeah, that's the big problem that I see with the property tax structure we have today versus what we could have with the land value tax.
Wow. Well, I hadn't actually thought of it that way before, that the renters all have to deal with rising rents. They have to relocate. They have to ensure that they're providing enough value, again, making enough money to live where they want to. But homeowners are excluded from that and almost have a pass. That's really interesting. What about when it comes to speculation and investment incentives? Do you see that as a big impact on housing prices, and would LVT address that?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that makes housing complicated and expensive is that it's both a consumption good and an investment good. So even if you only wanted to buy a home to live in it, you're paying for the fact that it's going to go up in value. And you pay, like, I don't think people really understand this part, that in places where property taxes are higher, the homes are actually more affordable than in places where the property taxes are lower. I think people hear property taxes going up and they think, like, oh, this is going to be bad for affordability, but it actually can keep homes affordable because you're not paying for the privilege of owning this investment asset. So yeah, that's one way that I think it can, land value tax helps simplify buying a home. People can really just focus on it as something that they get consumption value out of from living in it, instead of it being this investment vehicle. And it's probably not even the best investment vehicle. If you really wanted to smartly invest your money, you should probably put it in a diversified asset like an index fund. Putting it all into just one home, like, is a bit riskier. But then there are all these laws in the United States, at least, that reduce that risk. So yeah, having everybody put their money in their home for an investment as an investment vehicle, it's not it's not the most beneficial thing, I think, for people or for the economy.
Yeah, and it's bidding up pricing. I mean, that's what we're seeing in parts of Canada. New condos, for instance, are being bought at least 50% by investors who don't live there, 90% in some other parts. Also want to circle back to one of the main incentives you mentioned earlier. I've seen this about allocation, people living in their homes too long. I saw a study by the Canadian Centre of Economics Analysis that said that in Ontario alone, there are 500,000 empty bedrooms. That's equivalent to 25 years worth of construction. So it's like we have the supply under our feet, we're just not using it correctly. And LVT would kind of nudge people to live to live within their needs and their desires, and provide the incentives to do so. Currently in Canada, the debate is really centered around supply. Everyone's pushing supply. We need more and more supply. But it seems that, you know, there are parts of Canada where supply has doubled in the last 40 years, and prices are still too expensive. Like, what's your take on that whole narrative that it's all about supply, and why do you think LVT should be part of that debate?
So supply increases can be great, but they really need to happen in the places where the land value is the highest. And if you have like a lot of single family homes and they're not being taxed according to land, they have like a property tax, or maybe they're not even being taxed that much to begin with. It's hard to get that land to turn over so that it can be put to its highest use. So if there's a lot of homes being developed out in the exurbs or the suburbs, it's not as beneficial to society as if those housing units were going in a city center where there are access to jobs, access to education, access to all of the things that cities have to offer. So from like an economic growth perspective, more housing is good, but you really do want it in the places where you're going to get the most economic boon out of it.
That's right. Okay. So most people think that land value tax is a property tax. And I know you've answered this question many times before, but for this audience, what is the difference between land value tax and property tax?
So typically a property tax has a land value tax element to it. You're just putting a tax on the total value of both the structure and the land underneath it. And that creates a distortion because it disincentivizes developing more property. It's kind of like a capital gains tax. It's typically not good from an economic perspective to tax investment because you necessarily reduce investment when you tax it. But moving from a property tax to only a land value tax, there is no distortionary effect because the land will be there no matter what. So moving to that kind of a tax system, it actually can promote economic growth. And it's the one tax that does that. There isn't really any other tax where you can extract money for services, social services, or redistribute it back to people, or use it for small business loans or whatever it is. There's no other source of tax revenue besides a land value tax that doesn't have the secondary effect of reducing economic output.
Yeah, it's been called the least bad tax by Milton and many others. So at Commonwealth, we've been doing modeling that shows that implementing a tax shift to capture 3/4 of the rental value of land through an LVT and shifting off of income tax as the source of that funding could actually reduce land values by 3/4 and the average home by 42%. I'm curious if you'd comment on that. Like, do you see LVT like a large scale shift really affecting prices, and how would you explain that dynamic?
Yeah, so I mean, the mechanism by which a land value tax actually reduces land values is that when you're buying the land, you're no longer going to get this stream, or I don't know if it's a stream. You're no longer going to get the investment value out of it. You're literally just buying it for the privilege of being able to build on it. But so it takes the speculation part out of it. And so without that investment value, the value drops to only the consumption value, the value that you personally get out of the land. So if you have a land value tax that captures 100% of land value, but you personally put a higher value than what the market puts on it, you still are going to want to buy the land and pay that tax. And it does have this nice effect that the people who value the land the most are the ones who end up buying it and by value at the most, I mean like internally valuing it, not valuing it for the investment value. Those are the people who actually have access to it. I mean, they do have to pay the tax, so it's not like everybody, it's not like it's just the personal value. You do have to actually have the money to pay the tax, but at least it reduces the initial cost of getting the deed to that land, and then you can build on it and have an income stream if you like put it to a use that is of economic value.
Thank you for the explanation. These are all tough, really tough questions that I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just learning with you on these things. Like another thing we've grappled with is, you know, if LVT is fully capitalized into housing prices, so prices come down, but we're exchanging smaller mortgages instead of paying higher taxes. Well, some may experience tax relief overall, but it's taxes. I mean, how does that actually improve affordability?
So I think the hard part is the transition from the current regime to the land value tax. In a world where land value tax has always existed, the person who owns the home, instead of paying, say, $2,000 a month for their mortgage, they may be only paying $1,000 a month for a mortgage, and the other $1,000 goes to the land value tax. So their affordability wouldn't change. But the problem, I think, with the transition is that currently you have people who might be paying $2,000 in their mortgage, and then you're asking them to pay another $1,000 in their land value tax, and they bought the home back before the land value tax when the asset value was part of the purchase. So those people might feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. I think at least in Detroit, the way that they've structured it is so that almost all homeowners get a reduction in taxes when it goes from property tax to land value tax. And I think, at least for the initial transition, that's a good way to structure it so that no homeowner feels like all of a sudden they have to pay this extra tax. They get the benefit of a reduced property tax replaced with a land value tax. And then moving forward, it would only be the land value tax, and maybe you could raise that incrementally over time. So it's not such a shock to go from the current regime to a new regime.
Okay, yeah, we'll probably talk about transition items soon. And I see there's some raised hands. We're going to go to audience back and forth in a bit. First, we're going to continue this fireside chat. Thanks a lot, Daryl. So what are your thoughts on a land value tax shift from income taxes as opposed to property taxes, or which would you favor?
I mean, like I mostly stay in the economics realm, and from an economic perspective, I think income taxes and property taxes are they both have distortions. With income tax, you're basically disincentivizing people to work, and with the property tax, you're disincentivizing people to build more properties. I don't really have a strong opinion about like which one is worse. But from the transition perspective, I think homeowners probably are going to feel like if their property tax bill isn't reduced when they get the land value tax, they might fight that more than if it's coming from their income tax. I think that would probably be harder for homeowners to understand. But from like a theoretical perspective, both property taxes and income taxes are bad taxes. And you don't even necessarily have to lower taxes. You could redistribute it back as like a stimulus payment, or like just a cash rebate that everybody gets. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to redistribute back the land value taxes, and I don't have a strong opinion about which one is better than the other one.
Okay, and what is there a model of LVT or LVT shift that you particularly favor? If you were to wave a magic wand and change the US, what would it look like in terms of LVT?
I mean, I haven't thought too deeply about it. I would be happy with whatever gets passed. I think that like the political economy of it is very complicated and probably differs for different countries and even different parts of the US. So any shift in the direction of a land value tax, I would support. I think like if I was in charge of designing it and pitching it, I would probably do something incremental where, like, you know, starting today, every year, you're going to get an extra 1% on your land value tax until, you know, eventually that goes up to be a full land value tax. I do think that is the ideal, but I think it'll be a long, I think people will have a hard time with the transition. I don't know. I honestly don't really have strong opinions about this. I'm not a politician, so I focus mostly on the economics.
So if I had a very long podcast interview myself with a real estate agent who was, I was trying to explain to him how LVT would not impact developers' incentives, but he didn't buy it. He thought it would reduce developers' profitability. I'm curious how you see the incentives around construction changing in a after land value tax system.
But I would think it would be good for developers. I mean, I think that's why Detroit is one of the first cities in America that is getting serious about it, because they want more development in the city of Detroit. There's been a lot of decay. There's been a lot of developers just kind of writing it off because of how high property taxes are, because those high property taxes have driven out, the middle class and upper middle class in Detroit. So I think developers are they have their models. They're pretty savvy. They can like discern what's a good investment and what's not. So I think that they would appreciate that, that for one, the cost of acquiring land would go down. Two, they would have like a more predictable, they wouldn't have to worry about financing the land value tax. So it would be just something on their balance sheet moving forward. They don't have to like get the money up front to acquire the land. It would be something that's distributed across time through the land value tax, and they wouldn't get taxed on the development that they do. So I think developers would be in favor of it.
And what about for investors? I mean, it seems like the majority of non-owner occupied homes are being bought by people in the top, 5 to 10% of income earnings, having second or third properties as a wealth creation vehicle, as you say. Like, if we succeeded in a transition, how do you see this impacting the incentive for someone to buy a home in order to rent it out?
So yeah, there are different kinds of investors. There are investors who buy the home, think like they're speculators basically, who buy the land or the home thinking it's going to go up in value, and the fact that they can get rent out of it is kind of secondary to them. But then there are some investors who are more focused on the property management aspect of being a landlord, and I think that job will continue to exist and continue to be important. And the big like apartment builder owners, I think that they see their value more in the property management side, but I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit out of my depth here, but I think that there's still a role for landlords in a world where there's land value tax, but instead of them getting rents from the fact that they own the land, they have to get rent from the fact that they're providing a service, that they are maintaining the property, that they're fixing issues that arise, that they are providing like services perhaps to the people who live in these apartment buildings. That's where they would make their profit margin. And it would lower, like you said, with the land costs going down, it would lower the cost of entry to become one of those kinds of property manager landlords.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree with you. I bought a property in my 20s, and I was so nervous about market fluctuations. I said, I'm only going to buy this if the rental yield on its own is self-justified, and I don't care if it never goes up in value. And I imagine that in a post-LVT world, it'll be like that. People will be providing a service, actually adding value through homes, as opposed to just benefiting from rising prices that they didn't work for. Yeah. So obviously, most people coming here know that LVT has been a concept that Henry George has made more popular in the last 150 years. And his fundamental premise was that progress creates more poverty because of our relationship to land and land values. I'm curious how you'd explain how an LVT system would actually reduce poverty as well as inequality. Like in Canada, for instance, land's worth over $6 trillion, but billionaires only have 250 billion. So it seems that all the debates we're having about inequality are looking at the wrong place. But how would it actually address poverty, and how do you see these dynamics playing out?
Yeah, I think the way that it would address poverty is by increasing economic growth, because it's an efficient tax. So if we reduce these other inefficient taxes and replace it with this efficient land value tax, then GDP growth would go up. And then we could take this wealth of GDP growth and redistribute it back to people who are the least wealthy, the lowest income earners. But there's also this other nice feature of land value tax, where land values are the highest where rich people live. Rich people, they put money into their schools, they put money into their parks, they, even just by being in like a glamorous neighborhood, it raises the value of the land that's there. And then on the flip side, land that is occupied by Black people or Indigenous people tends to have lower values because of the stigma associated with those areas. So with land value tax, you would naturally have this effect where the people who live in wealthy areas are paying a higher tax than the people who are living in areas of poverty that probably have less access to jobs, schools, food, their food deserts in poor neighborhoods. So it would naturally create a balance there where you have this natural progressive tax structure with a land value tax.
Yeah, so do you, we had a lot of questions on a shift. A lot of those are political economy questions though, so I don't know if you want to go there, but I'll just throw some out, and we can always delay that and discuss it as a group later if you prefer. But one of the first problems that come up are, what do we do with existing homeowners if we increase LVT, who will lose equity, and in particular seniors who are on low incomes, but in fixed incomes that might be less than their LVT. Have you thought of like what could be done in a transition to ease that those problems?
So the problems of like a senior who can't afford to stay in the home under a land value tax, but they could have afforded to stay in the home under like the current property tax regime, that can be solved by simply providing that person with a place to live on a plot of land with lower value. I don't know how politically feasible that would be, but at least, so I'm thinking about my own grandmother who sold her home to move into senior living facility. And the senior living facility is extremely expensive. She lives in San Diego. And she's putting all this equity that she had into her home now into the senior living facility. And so it's not really benefiting her. She would have been better off with a lower land value and more affordable senior care. So you could design it so that you're redistributing the land value tax into things like senior care facilities. It would be easier, hopefully, to develop those because you're not taxing the properties. You could even like lower taxes on those facilities or lower the income taxes on care workers, which are really expensive in a place with really high land values. So I think a lot of the problem of like, where is this person going to go? Those can be addressed and actually are easier to solve under a land value tax regime than without a land value tax regime. But that might be a really hard thing to sell, and it probably wouldn't be instantaneous that like once you have a higher land value tax, senior care all of a sudden becomes more affordable. I think that transition would be difficult and would need to be managed.
And then there's also the problem of existing property owners who might see a decline in net worth if we did announced a large shift, even if we did a 20-year rollout, which is we've modeled based on a paper, a Hudson Tiedemann paper, like a large scale tax shift onto land. Market would react quickly with prices coming down fairly soon. And we're just thinking about like what would be done, like should anything be offered in that case, and in particular with mortgages, right? Even now in Canada, just due to rising interest rates, like a quarter of all the mortgages with the big banks are either in a negative amortization, which I didn't even know was possible, or 35-year plus length mortgages. Like what could be done about when mortgages go below or property values fall below mortgage rates? Like, is it possible to like unlend that money or cancel it or something?
Yeah, I'm trying to think through. So yeah, if you rolled out a schedule that said sometime in the future, it's going to go to 100% or high percentage, that would get capitalized into the current price because anybody buying it would know.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as you have a system where property taxes don't go up, like the property taxes are offset by land value tax, so you're still paying at least the same amount in tax or less as a homeowner. That homeowner could continue to afford to live in that home, and they should be able to buy their next home. But I guess what you're saying is if it reduces the value below their mortgage, and they may be underwater on their mortgage. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I haven't thought about it much, but yeah, it seems like a hard problem. I guess it's an argument for going incremental and not announcing a huge 20-year rollout, but just saying like, this is what we're doing today, and we'll address it again in 5 years and put it up for another vote, as opposed to like putting it on a set schedule. But yeah, it seems like a tough problem.
Yeah, well, and we're assembling solutions in a transition plan, which we'd love to share with you and get your feedback
Yeah.
on. But yeah, it's a tough issue. I can't believe that we're allowing negative amortizations and these long mortgages in Canada right now. That seems nuts. So I guess being from Redfin, one might wonder if this is going to bring down housing prices. Isn't that bad for your business? And why do you support LVT in that case?
I believe that if it brought down home values, it would increase transactions by, it would be offset by an increase in transactions. Like, we don't make money just off of high home values. We are better at making money when there's a lot of homes being exchanged. And the problem with the current regime is that people stay in their homes for a very long time instead of moving on to the next home that may fit their needs better. But in a world where there's a land value tax instead of the current property tax system, people would turn over their homes more frequently. So it's actually, I don't think it's net negative for a brokerage.
Okay, yeah, I mean, as a business owner myself, I prefer more volume leads to more revenue, even if the gross margin is a bit smaller per transaction. It's
Definitely.
just safer, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, let's see, a few other questions here. You've had success talking and writing about this in the mainstream news outlets. Any advice on building media attention for this? Like, how are you going about it? Getting CBS News and Bloomberg to talk about LVT.
Well, it helps when there is a news hook, like the Detroit news of it being proposed, and then again, I think it's going again in Minnesota. So if there's an actual bill that's being proposed, that's a good news hook that reporters will talk about. The Bloomberg interview, the host of that show just had a particular interest in it. There should be a New York Times article coming out about land value tax soon. I talked to a reporter at the New York Times about it. I think that like reporters are noticing the movement. They've seen what happened with the YIMBY movement and how successful it was, and I think that makes them take more seriously these online movements that are based on bipartisan issues. Like, I think before they may have thought like this is not going to go anywhere, but since the YIMBYs were so successful in California, I think that they are eyeing land value tax as the next issue that could break out of the internet and become something that's actually implemented in real life. So yeah, not all reporters know about it, but if there's an actual bill being proposed, and that usually piques their interest and they want to talk about it.
Great. Please keep up the amazing work.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess it's a good time to go into audience Q&A. So I have the Slido here. Everyone feel free to keep asking questions and vote. And I guess the top question right now is, at the very latest, how soon can we transition to an LVT-based tax system without causing a real estate crash?
Well, one thing that I would like to see more is just like at a local level, anytime there's a tax levied for like, we need funding for the school, we need funding for the police department, we need funding for the fire department, I would like to see that funded through a land value tax as opposed to any other tax. I think it's something that local governments should learn about and see as something that they can use as kind of like a free tax revenue card that they can pull that won't have these perverse effects on their local economies.
Yeah, and actually transit comes to mind, and
right.
Ideally self-financing transit infrastructure. Could we have a national hyperloop that's funded through land value capture or
I don't know the answer to that, especially not in Canada. I'm not familiar with Canadian politics. I think in the US it's a little bit tricky because I think it's unclear if Congress has the power to levy a land value tax. States definitely do. That's why I think there's been some success, like trying to get or at least it seemed there are early signs of success in Michigan and Minnesota because they're attacking at the state level. But I'm not sure how it works in Canada.
We're seeing some success in parts of the world with land value capture, which is capturing the value of a rezoning as opposed to a generalized broad-based LVT. I believe Singapore has a 70% land value capture tax on new developments of the rezoning change. Australia passed a bill in one of its regions recently. I'm curious how you see the benefits of that versus an LVT or one or the other or both.
Yeah, I like those. So if there's already government-owned land that they're thinking of turning private, instead of just selling the land, they can rent that land indefinitely, and that's effectively a land value tax. And because it's like new private land that's being created, it doesn't have the same. There's no like entrenched interests that will fight it. So I think that's another way to increase the prevalence of land value tax, is to say, like, it's in Seattle, for example, they just passed a law, I think it was earlier this year, where they created a public authority that can build housing on publicly owned land. And that's kind of like a stealth land value tax, because they're not going to sell the land, but they're going to bring in private developers to build housing, and there have to be a certain number of affordable units, and they pay rent back to the city of Seattle, and that rent is essentially a land value tax.
Yeah, so there was I had on the without a crash. I talked to a prominent economist in Canada who thought that our plan would cause a crash. And so we're working on a transition plan for how to avoid the worst impacts of that. But I like your idea also, you said earlier, about maybe phasing it in and then having votes every so often. Boy, that would be contentious. Imagine. So we have a question here on a fairly sensitive topic, commenting on when you said people staying in their home too long. Does that mean seniors choosing to stay in their homes? That's the problem. And it is contentious. I mean, as I mentioned, that Canadian Center of Economics Analysis study showed that there's 25 years worth of construction equivalent empty bedrooms in Ontario right now. That's mostly being held by empty nesters, seniors that are in homes that where everyone's already moved out. So, like, I guess you want to talk more about that problem? Like, how do we make that not seem like seniors aren't the problem? It's just the incentives.
Yeah, I mean I think that it seems like land value tax, it hurts like the little old lady or man that lives in their house their whole life, and now you're telling them they have to leave. But I don't really have a good answer for this. I guess morally, I don't see it as too much to ask somebody to move, or to say that like there's going to be a better housing option for them, not necessarily on this exact plot of land that they've lived on. I don't think that just because you bought a house 50 years ago when home values were low, that entitles you to live there for the rest of your life. And I think especially like given the history of United States and Canada, that like, this land doesn't really belong to anybody when you think about it. So I personally don't think of it as too much to ask. I think that we just need to make sure that their next place that those people move to is actually a better fit to their needs than their current home. And then I think people would be more excited about it. But I think it's hard to break from that mindset that people are allowed to own land indefinitely.
Yeah, well, even the allowed word, it's really just about incentives, right? And we want to make it so that people would prefer to right size their homes to what they need.
Yeah, I guess allowed to without having to pay anything back.
Yeah, it seems like a shift in consciousness is really required, like a change in moral for some of these ideas where, it's fair for someone who's a family that's young and working to live close to the jobs more than it's fair for someone who's not to live close to jobs. And the idea that land value itself should be seen as commonwealth versus land tenure is private, land value is not. It seems this goes all the way back to the foundings of economics. I mean, Adam Smith was for this, and that we're kind of tricking ourselves that we live in capitalism when the land incentives really are more like feudalism that we were trying to get away from. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like, just any ruminations from you on that. Like, what are some of the sort of ethics and morals that need to shift in order to move towards a solution like this?
I think that you can get people on both like sides of the political spectrum to buy into a land value tax when you're talking to people on the left, you can focus on the equity aspects and the unfairness of how land is distributed, about who owns what land. I mean, going back in history, at least in the United States, it wasn't that long ago that like Black people weren't even allowed to buy land in certain areas. So I think if you focus on those equity aspects on the left, you can get people to buy into it, and you can convince them that it's okay, that maybe it's okay to ask, you know, grandma to move into a smaller housing unit if it means that we'll have less homelessness and we'll have less poverty. And then on the right, I think you can get them to buy in if you talk about economic growth and how people get land without contributing anything back to the economy, and how it's not fair because you should have to, you know, work to have money in society. I think that those are the values on the right that you could tap into. It's really only like a small portion of people who I think are going to resist it. And they're not going to resist it because of their political ideology. I think they're going to resist it because of the way it personally impacts their perceived wealth. So I guess getting people to focus on their values as opposed to like what's best for them personally would be a good way to get people to vote for it. And people do vote against their own personal interests when it aligns with their value system. So I think that's doable.
That's right. So a couple questions here on does LVT work in all markets? For instance, we kind of understand how to work in the cities, but what about rural areas? You know, some of the modeling that we did that I think might be hopefully is wrong. We're still working on it. Shows farmers being like left with a bit in trouble. Like, well, yeah, how do we make that work for in all cases?
So ideally, I think a land value tax should take into account the externalities associated with the land. So if there is a national security interest in having a certain amount of corn being farmed every single year, that is an externality that you would want to take into account when assessing the land value. And you may want to give some kind of a land value tax credit to people who are using the land to the public good. So that might include farming, it might include some kind of like conservation. I think that could be addressed through like a credit system. It might be a little bit hard to assess, there might be some bureaucracy that goes into that, but to me, land value, it's not just the market value. I think you have to take into account the societal value.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So there's just a lot of questions on implementation. You know, would you consider implementing a full 100% capture of the rental value of land, or close to full, like 85%? Or how high or low should it be in your view?
I mean, I think that if you did 100% overnight, it would probably cause a lot of chaos. So I don't think that's the best way to go. So I guess I'm more of an incrementalist. I think it is a bit of a hard challenge to transition people away from it. Maybe you could set it up. I don't know. I guess, I mean, you could just like pay homeowners off in one big lump sum if you wanted to go to 100%. That just says like, we're going to go to 100% next year. We're going to pay off all your mortgages that same year and reset. I don't know how much more feasible that is, but maybe that's a way around it. I'm really just spitballing here.
I just had a fly has landed on my nose like 4 times in this conversation.
I don't
I don't know what's going on here. So yeah, just looking at again at audience submitted questions. I think we talked a bit about yeah, how to bridge the gap. Yeah, I mean, you just addressed that question about how to address falling net worths potentially. There's a question: are Canadian politicians on side of these exciting ideas? I mean, I can answer a bit of that. Currently, at least in the Ontario Liberal leadership race, 2 candidates are promoting changing the province to allow land value tax so that cities could experiment, even having a pilot zone. I'm not sure what's happening in other provinces, but I think in BC, there must be a lot of support because they keep trying to emulate LVT through other means, like an underutilization tax and things like that. So it seems everyone knows about it, but everyone's afraid to talk about it because of any suggestion that we should bring down the cost of housing, which is kind of infuriating, right? Because we need to bring down the cost of housing, and there's no evidence that increasing more supply through the programs they're suggesting will even hold prices steady. It's just nuts. something more needs to happen, which is why we're talking about this today. So I guess another question: won't all landlords just jack up the rent when faced with the higher tax? Sorry, but we all have to answer this question. It's one of the most common questions.
Yeah, so landlords already charge as much as they could possibly charge. So if you tax them based on the value of the land, there's not really anything they can do to avoid that tax. If they were to raise it on their tenant, the tenant is presumably already paying as much as they could pay, and they would go to the next landlord to rent a unit from them. And since, everybody is paying the land value tax, there really isn't any like arbitrage. There's just nowhere to get this to jack up the rent to. I know it's a kind of hard thing to grasp. Maybe think there's a better way to explain it. If I think you're starting from zero, if you're like acquiring a property and you're trying to calculate how much you could rent it out for, whether you have this, like, again, I'm going to go back to the $2,000 mortgage, or you have a $1,000 mortgage and a $1,000 land value tax, your monthly costs are the same as a landlord. So there really wouldn't be any change in like what your calculation is for, is it going to be profitable for me to rent this out or not? So going from like, am I going to acquire this property and rent it out? The math doesn't change. And then if you already own the property and you're already renting it out, it's hard for me to imagine that you aren't already charging as much as you possibly could charge to your tenant. I mean, there might be some landlords who are really just not in the loop and arbitrarily set their rent below market rate, and then they get the land value tax and they pass it on. But I don't think that there are a ton of these landlords who are charging less than what demand is. I mean, that's kind of the problem, is that supply is inelastic. So landlords are able to charge whatever demand is. There's no threat of entry of new supply. If anything, landlords would end up charging less once that new supply comes online, and they do have to compete with even more landlords.
Speaking of rents, I mean, I see discussion in two different ways in the Georges community. Some say that it will lower the cost of tenant rents, because it's not just about housing prices, it's also tenants rents. Some say it won't have any impact on it because rents are rents, and that this only affects all the incentives around it. What's your view? Like, do you think this would lead to lower tenant rents as well as lower housing prices, or not?
I know. So I live in Wisconsin. I live on like a pretty large plot of land, which is single family home. It's only zoned for single family, so that's like all I can do with the land. But if overnight it was rezoned to be multifamily and I was taxed a land value tax, all of a sudden I have this opportunity where I could build an ADU in my backyard, maybe even more than one ADU, and create housing and rent it out. And if everybody in my neighborhood is under the same incentive, you'd probably see a lot more of that, and the supply of housing units would go up, and that's what would cause rents to fall.
Okay, so more supply would lead to lower rents overall. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
You would also have less slumlords, as I call them, people who basically don't maintain their property and rent it out to like the lowest income people and don't provide them really any service as a landlord. Those people would now be incentivized to maintain their property because they want to get at least the land value back in rent. So that means they'd have to develop the property, and probably they might charge more, but they'd be charging more based on the improvements that they put in.
Okay, so I think we're near the end of the hour. Usually on these calls, there's so many questions that we just stick around. But are you available a bit longer, or should we end it at 3?
I can maybe do 5 minutes after 3, but I gotta get to another meeting.
Okay, well, before we go into more questions, maybe we have a number of experts in the call here. We have Ed Dodson, Frank de Jong. Frank de Jong is a former Ontario Green Party leader and has done a lot to promote this idea in Canada. He's been an inspiration for us. I mean, Ed, Frank, would you guys like to comment or ask any questions directly of Daryl, or feel free?
On the point of whether rents will go down, rents will go down for tenants whose building is on a smaller plot of land. So if your multi-unit building is on a large plot of land, your rents will go up. So once again, it's an incentive to build more housing on less land, and that's exactly what we want. And the other one that's interesting, how we say LVT will reduce the cost of housing. Well, it doesn't, only in so much as what you said, Daryl, that you won't need a mortgage for the land portion of your property. So the people who are going to be the businesses and the people who are going to be most impacted financially by the notion of LVT are the banks and the mortgage lenders, because they are going to, our banks not is not like 70% of the revenue stream, or 80 is real estate now. And if we had full scale LVT, the bank's revenue would drop by 80% because they would lose like the lion's share of their entire revenue stream. It would be if you could snap your fingers, it would be a wildly shocking, disruptive force. That's my comment. And also, I just wanted to say, Daryl, it is so lovely to hear you speak on LVT. You are marvelously articulate and engaging. Thank you so much. Keep it up.
Thank you. I have not thought through the banking impacts. That's definitely something for me to go and research. So yeah, you make a really good point that all of these mortgages are held by banks. I mean, that's part of the reason we had that subprime mortgage crisis. Maybe if we had LVT, we wouldn't be having any more of those mortgage crises anymore. So it wouldn't be the worst thing to take that out of the banks, but it would be a hard transition.
Well, actually, sorry, I sort of overspoke there. It would only be about half of the revenue that banks now get from mortgages, because roughly half of every property is land, and they would still be offering mortgages for the improvements, but no longer for the land.
Yes.
To jump in, I guess, Daryl, I come from the banking sector. I'm retired from Fannie Mae, where I was Fannie Mae's land value tax guy. And I did my best to promote land value taxation in the United States as part of the path to affordable housing. So I've been involved in it for a long time ever since. But I would counter a little bit of what Frank had to say, but for another time. The basic observation I make is very few banks hold mortgage loans as whole loan assets. They're almost all packaged and sold to Wall Street as mortgage-backed securities. So yeah, I'm not sure. We'd have to have a long discussion. Maybe Floyd, you'd want to invite me back to do a session on the relationship between banking, mortgage lending, and what would happen under LVT. But for you, Daryl, as an economist, my one sort of observation is this, and I've been using this analysis in a lot of my writing in the last few years, is that we have to begin to think and recognize that housing units are depreciating assets. The ownership of housing requires ongoing expenditures every day for maintenance, and then about every 10 or 15 years, huge expenditures for systems replacement. So if it makes any sense to tax housing units, which are depreciating assets, then we should have as public policy the taxation of all depreciating assets, because most other depreciating assets aren't as necessary as housing. So we ought to have an annual tax on the depreciated value of our computers, of our telephones, of our radios, of our lawnmowers. I mean, all that sounds very ridiculous. And yet we accept the fact that we ought to be paying an annual tax on the depreciating value of our house. And I think that helps distinguish the discussion between the asset, the housing unit, and the non-depreciating asset with an inelastic supply of land. So that's my, other than that, everything you said, if I was giving the talk, I would have probably said almost identically.
Yeah, that's a good point. The depreciating asset, it's like hidden in our current property tax. Your property tax bill usually only goes up, but if it was purely property tax separated from land value tax, you would see your land tax bill go up and your property tax bill go down with the depreciation.
I mean, our assessors,
not how it works.
I don't know about in Canada, but in the United States, they do a terrible job.
Yeah,
because they do not revalue housing unit value as a depreciating asset. In fact, in some of our counties in the United States, assessments aren't done even every decade. We have terrible assessments in many parts of the United States.
Yeah, it's so true.
Daryl, if I can jump in one last time, I wonder, I don't believe I heard you mention the term economic rent. Economic rent is synonymous with, super profits or royalties, what we call in Canada, or unearned income. Now, do you use the term economic rent? Is it a valuable term, and should it be resurrected?
When I'm talking to non-economists, I steer away from it because I think it's confusing to people because they immediately jump to the rent that they pay. Like even talking about rent seeking, it's hard for people to understand what that means. I think it needs a rebranding. Personally, that's why I don't usually use it with non-economists.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. Maybe I'll leave it on note that when I think about like the team that's running Commonwealth was and is still running UBI Works and promoting a basic income. And one of the reasons we started Commonwealth is because we see that cost of housing is the #1 expense in people's lives and mortgages. And when I look at what's keeping people on the hamster wheel and preventing shorter work weeks, it's how we're dealing with these incentives that are driving up this cost. So we really got to look at this. Yeah, really got to bring down the cost of housing and make the rents people are paying work for them instead of work for others, as like the #1 thing that affects most people, the rents and the mortgages. So thank you very much for all the work you're all doing. And Daryl, I'm really glad to have made this acquaintance, and we'll follow up with you with our proposals and maybe get some feedback from you if you have time.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was nice to meet you all.
Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah,
Bye.
we'll see you next time.